gonna say afternoon, but it's surely evening on the East Coast. Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you to our discussion this evening or tonight, Navigating the Horizons, Understanding the Impact of DEI Legislation on Medical Training. Thank you all for showing up. This is a hot topic right now, and hopefully it would be a very vibrant discussion tonight. I am Dr. Melissa Walker. I am presently serving as a trustee for the National Medical Association. A little background about myself as we begin. I am presently a family medicine physician down in the South in San Antonio, Texas. I have a private practice that is named after my mother, the Carroll Clinic for Family-Centered Healthcare. And I also serve as an assistant professor at the University of the Incarnate Word School of Osteopathic Medicine. I am a proud graduate of an HBCU, Grambling State University, and I attended medical school at Midwestern University in Chicago, Illinois. And that's a little about myself. We have some distinguished panelists with us this evening. I would like to begin by introducing Madam President from the National Medical Association, Dr. Yolanda Lawson. Dr. Lawson is a board-certified OBGYN and the founder of Madewell OBGYN in Dallas, Texas. She also is a fellow of the American Congress of Obstetrics and Gynecology and a member of the Texas Medical Association, where she serves on the Physician Health and Wellness Committee. Dr. Lawson earned her medical degree at the University of Arkansas School of Medical Sciences and completed her internship at Morehouse School of Medicine in Atlanta, Georgia. And she completed residency at St. John Hospital and Medical Center in Detroit, Michigan. Next, we have Dr. William McDade. Dr. McDade is the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, which we call ACGME, and is an adjunct professor of anesthesiologist at Rush Medical College. Dr. McDade is a board-certified anesthesiologist, having graduated from the Pritzker Medical Scientist Training Program, earning a PhD in biophysics and theoretical biology. He completed his internship in internal medicine at the University of Chicago and his residency at Mass General Hospital. Dr. William McDade. Thirdly, we have Dr. David Henderson. Dr. Henderson is a graduate of Amherst College and Southern Illinois University School of Medicine. He has 19 years of community-based practice, including 1 year working as a physician volunteer in Sierra Leone in West Africa. In May of 2021, he received the Yukon Board of Directors Faculty Recognition Award, which is the highest honor bestowed upon a faculty by the school. In December of 2022, he retired and began as the inaugural Vice President for Equity, Diversity, and Belonging in Medical Education at the American Medical Association. So those are our distinguished guests who you will hear from in a little bit, but I would like to begin by kind of laying the framework of what we will be discussing this evening. So when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and frameworks focus on three main areas. That's training, organizational policies and practices, as well as organizational culture. Developing an increased sense of self and organizational awareness related to value and the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So there are many organizations who have set their framework for this topic because, as I started out by saying, this is a hot topic. It's been a hot topic for a while. But the Association of American Medical Colleges has their own framework, and this is kind of what we're structuring our program this evening around. So I don't know if we're going to list what that framework is by showing any of the slides. If not, I'll just go ahead and identify what the AAMC is using as a framework for their discussion. Number one, begin self-reflection and educating ourselves. Number two, become anti-racist, diverse, equitable, and inclusive. Three, collaborate with other communities. Four, speak out about systemic racism. And I believe that that is all of their framework. I said that that's the framework by which this discussion will take place, but it's actually, discussion is so important right now because of a piece of legislation that was introduced. Those of you who are watching may be familiar with it, but on March 19th, Representative Greg Murphy, who is a medical doctor, Dr. Murphy, along with 35 Republicans, co-sponsors, introduced the Educate Act, okay? Educate's been in capital letters EDUCATE, which is an acronym for Embracing Anti-Discrimination, Unbiased Curriculum, and Advancing Truth in Education. So this Educate Act would modify the act that we know as the Higher Education Act of 1965, and it is set in place to forbid graduate medical schools from participating in federal student loan programs or receiving federal financial aid if the institutions implement specific DEI policies and criteria. The bill would also mandate that accreditation organizations and groups provide proof of the Department of Education secretary that they do not demand the adoption of any of the policies by an institution or a program in order to be accredited. So that is what the discussion will center around today. So as we begin, we've had my introduction, but I am going to allow our panelists to give a brief introduction of themselves and also begin our talk for tonight. And we will start with Dr. Lawson.
Thank you, Dr. Walker, and good evening, everyone. Again, Dr. Yolanda Lawson. I'm an OBGYN based in Dallas and the 124th president of the National Medical Association. So thank you for allowing me to give just some brief remarks as we open up this discussion tonight. I'm really looking forward to in this discussion with two colleagues who I admire, and I admire their viewpoints. So since 1895, the National Medical Association has been advocating on behalf of Black physicians, minoritized communities. We have led through the civil rights movement, continuing to advocate. And so this proposed legislation is quite disturbing and it's quite concerning. I'm aware of the reframing of this colorblind notion, but there are historical facts and occurrences and evidence that racism and discrimination in this country exist, and we definitely have that evidence as it relates to medical education. We know at present only 5.7% of physicians in this country are Black, so there is a continued need to eliminate disparities and to enhance a diverse medical workforce. The underrepresented students, the Black students and others that you see in hospitals, attending majority institutions, many of those are there because of this work and advocacy. And these policies took time. Many of these policies occurred because we could not rely on individuals to do the right thing. And so as we think about this proposed legislation and what it means for us, we know that we need more Black physicians, not less. And so I'm really looking forward to this discussion tonight to arm our members and others who are joining us this evening with information that they are armed with to advocate at the local level, at their states, as we have seen most recently this week. Alabama introduced anti-DEI policies. I again express to you, I am in Texas. We know that that has occurred here in my state. And so it is, of course, with high concern that I have around what this is going to do as it impacts a diverse healthcare workforce. It's not only race that we're discussing here. I think we have to think about ageism. I think we have to think about religion, gender, sexuality, all of these other categories that have benefited from DEI initiatives. So I'll turn over to my colleagues. Thank you, Dr. Walker, for moderating this discussion tonight.
You're welcome. Thank you, Dr. Lawson. Dr. McDade?
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate today. You know, the legislation itself is not really very well constructed, as it turns out, but I think it really speaks to a sentiment that's going across the country, where there's a wave of anti-Black, anti-minority in general sentiment by people who are part of the dominant culture. I think it is a feeble attempt to say that we'd like to keep things the way they were and to deny the progress that's been made in recent years. So after every sequence of advances that we've seen historically in the country, going from the Civil War with Reconstruction, going to the Civil Rights Acts that were passed in the 60s, and then the backlash that occurred subsequently, we see a backlash or retrenching of effort against the progress that had been made by African American individuals, in particular minoritized people in general. And what this represents is now bringing us into medicine. You know, when you looked at the Supreme Court's decision a year ago now almost, which banned the use of race consciousness in terms of higher education admissions, one of the things they talked about was the idea that we need metrics in order to determine when we should stop our affirmative action measures. The problem, of course, is in medicine, our metric is health inequities, health disparities. And that's a fantastic metric that actually determines what our response should be in terms of who we educate in medicine. We know that historically, the people who care in greatest proportion for African Americans are African American physicians. And the propensity with which African Americans take care of African Americans in this country compared to whites taking care of African Americans is almost 24-1, that you have a greater likelihood of seeing a Black patient if you're a Black physician. And so when you look at the outsized role that Black physicians have in caring for Black patients in primary care, that number goes up to 40-1 compared to white physicians. Making a new Black physician is essential. When you look at what's happened historically in the United States in 1910, the Flexner Report suggested that we should keep at least a couple of African American medical schools open. At the time, there were 7 African American medical schools in the country. After the Flexner Report, that went down to 2. And in Flexner's report in chapter 14, he talks about the medical education of the Negro, in which he says that in order to stop the spread of contagion from the Black community to the white community, we have to have a couple of medical schools that train good physicians, not necessarily surgeons, but people who can be hygienists. The idea that racially concordant care is built into the fabric of medical education is right there in chapter 14 in the Flexner Report. And that's what we've used over the last 112 years now in order to guide our pathway in medical education in this country. And that's one of the problems, I think, is that we are rooted in a history that this legislation, for instance, wants to deny.
All right. Thank you, Dr. McDade. Dr. Henderson?
Thank you very much, Dr. Walker. And Dr. McDade and Dr. Lawson, it's great to be with you here tonight. And I'll echo a lot of what the two of you just said. The anti-DEI bill recently introduced in the House of Representatives is another in a multitude of efforts to roll back DEI efforts in education. From the anti-woke campaign in Florida to the recent bill in Alabama that bans school staff from teaching, quote, divisive concepts. and legislation attacking healthcare for LGBTQ plus community members in many state legislatures across the country. The newly proposed legislation in the House of Representatives is directed specifically at medical schools, as has been discussed, and seeks to ban DEI offices or any other, quote, functional equivalents, unquote. While the legislation might not go anywhere, physicians in training in our medical schools must strive to improve care for historically marginalized and minoritized communities. Our Code of Medical Ethics requires that we provide care for all people without discrimination. This means that no individual should be adversely treated on the basis of their sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, or national origin. So what do we know? I think as Dr. Lawson alluded to a bit earlier, African-American physicians comprise about 5% of the physician workforce, and American Indians less than 1%. We know there are notable health disparities in communities of color. We know there have been historic barriers to care. We also know that there have been historic barriers to becoming a physician. It's important that we acknowledge harm and injustice in honest ways without attempting to erase history. We must be focused on improving health and health equity. This is how we move forward in medicine and also as a society. For me, this legislation speaks to the necessity of forming coalitions of resistance. This can occur in many different levels, from forming grassroots coalitions similar to those that orchestrated protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in 2020, to the statement recently released today by 10 medical education organizations, including the ACGME, which Dr. McDade represents, and the AMA, which I represent. And if you'll bear with me, I can read it. It goes as follows. We represent organizations and healthcare professionals in the United States, including physicians of varied specialties and backgrounds who dedicate their entire careers to improving patient outcomes. For decades, we have strived to equip physicians with the best tools and evidence so our patients receive the highest quality care possible. Our efforts to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion seek to address the long-standing, well-documented inequities in our healthcare system and its impact on the health of our patients and communities. Excellence in patient care cannot exist until we have physician workforce capable of caring for the patients and their needs holistically, and until the profession of medicine is accessible to all qualified individuals. We stand together in our support of enhancing inclusive excellence and yielding the best results for all our members and the patients they serve.
Excellent.
From my perspective, I think if the history of the struggle for individual and collective rights has taught us anything, we know we should not let differing phenotypic expressions of our shared genotype obscure our commonality. This is our nation, and we are its people, and efforts to abridge our individual or collective health cannot and should not be tolerated.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson. Well, you've heard from each of our distinguished panelists, and so now I would like to go into some actual questions. Interesting enough, I'll just lead in by saying this. I was not watching when this when the representative came forth and he had, a group around him when he was in, but I pulled it up on YouTube and I watched it. And what was interesting to me is that seemingly over and over again, they were talking about the fact that DEI, or the utilization of DEI in getting medical school students, means that the students are less qualified and are going to be poor physicians. And so, and I just, as I listened to that, I kept thinking to myself, now where is the statistics that says that, So I would like to begin with this question. The Educate Act states that DEI in medical education distracts from important medical education training and expert patient care. How is the implication that DEI training is not an important part of medical education dangerous? Did you get that? Or do you want me to repeat it? Who would like to start?
I'll jump in on this one.
Okay.
I would say that the idea that you can treat an individual without understanding who they are, where they come from, what their backgrounds are, is detrimental to their health of that individual. If you don't understand the types of things that a person has to endure in on a daily basis, you can't very well treat them, understanding that their problems may actually impact their health. The idea that there are things aside from the patient-physician encounter, those social determinants of health, that impact the person's life, impact the person's lifespan, is short-sighted. And it took us a long time in medicine before we really got good appreciation for how important those social determinants of health are. Ignoring the wholeness of an individual and how they fit into the context of society is very short-sighted and means that you're going to lend or yield or deliver substandard care to that person. So DEI understanding isn't dangerous to anyone. It actually helps you to care better for the patient who may be the victim of society and societal influences. So the idea that people are not prepared by understanding and subverting their own cultures, subjecting their own culture to a lesser role in lieu of taking care of their patients, I think is a fundamental thing that physicians all have to learn. This is a concept we refer to as cultural humility, where you subjugate your own culture and say, I'm going to put that aside and try to understand what's happening to my patients. And Melanie Turvlon rather, and Jan Marie Garcia advanced this now 30 years ago. And my thinking on this one is that we have to do a better job of educating our physicians to do the same.
Thank you, Dr. McDade. Well said. Uh,
I
Well,
can
if-
follow that up a bit.
sure, Dr. Henderson.
I mean, I think it was in the early part of the last century, the early 1900s, a group of social epidemiologists began to define social determinants of health, sort of what we now call social determinants of health. And they were largely ignored for the better part of a century. We understand now that the care that people actually receive, the care we deliver, I mean, only accounts for about 10% to 15% of the issues that are responsible for their lack of health. And so the rest of the determinants of their health are social and structural. And if we don't understand that, then we won't be able to actually really impact the things that most affect people. In fact, we won't be able to work effectively in teams, which is at the core of the way that healthcare is organized now, and teaching and medical education is also organized. DEI frameworks, as Dr. McDade alluded to, I mean, have been really sort of crucial in teaching about concepts like social and structural determinants, and also things like structural competency, so that we can actually engage patients in ways that are meaningful and impactful, and help be agents in the progress and improvement of their healthcare, as opposed to just writing a prescription and shaking their hand and walking to the next exam room.
So, Dr. Walker, I agree with you. I was most disturbed as they continued to talk about merit in his press conference. And it's disturbing that DEI is equated to an individual being able to provide less quality care, being less intelligent to matriculate through medical school. And so it's very concerning that those two are trying to be joined together. Yes. And so it's harmful. I find it very harmful. We know that these principles around DEI and these frameworks and that inclusivity, I think it enhances the educational environment for everyone, actually. And so I think you can create and craft, I think about a physician being whole, right? Being versatile. There are some physicians who have better talent. We always hear what bedside manner, right? So some people,
Yes.
communication is a big factor for us, but to equate that an individual is going to be less capable, unable to deliver quality, be an excellent surgeon, be an excellent diagnostician, is very harmful. And it's an ongoing narrative that I really strongly hope and feel should stop, barring all of the issues around health that we have in this country. As we talk about healthcare disparities, I'm an OBGYN, and I always when I'm talking about maternal mortality, I always like to highlight, while we hear about this problem for Black women, all women in the United States, right, fare worse than other women in other developed countries. And so healthcare, and when you think about these disparities, not only around race, gender, other types of communities, again, the rhetoric is very harmful.
Truly, Dr. Lawson, thank you for that. Thank you all for that, chiming in on that question. Having said that, the next question that I'd like to pose to you, HBCUs, and I open by saying that I'm a proud graduate of Grambling State University, but HBCUs produce the largest number of Black physicians in the country. Many HBCUs operate on the ideology of educating on Black history and how the lack of equity in healthcare affects people of color in the United States. How would banning DEI in medical schools affect those institutions and the students they serve? I'm going to start with Dr. Lawson then.
Sure. So we know over this, if you think about the last 2 years when much of this movement began, right? I think about last year, I was president-elect chairing NMA's, the Health Policy Committee, and we started getting, we saw these lawsuits. We saw the lawsuits around scholarships designated for students of color. We started, this movement started and the momentum started. But you think about the HBCU medical schools were included, right? They were being delivered warnings, right, around their practices. But I think it goes back to what Dr. McDade brought up earlier. Failure to acknowledge the past. There is a reason these institutions exist, right? And so for me, I think I shared this with one of my colleagues last week. I'm literally baffled, right? By the audacity to go after our HBCU medical schools as entities that are discriminating when their whole existence was formed because of discrimination.
Thank you. Anyone else like to chime in on that question?
I'll just say that, I think our HBCUs are the most diverse medical schools in the country. And to say that they discriminate when their student population is representative of the population of the country broadly, I think is pretty ridiculous. And again, since they produce the lion's share of Black physicians, it would seem certainly counterproductive to limit their capacity to do that. I think as we move forward, particularly thinking about the affirmative action decision by the Supreme Court, I think mission-driven policies are likely to be the most successful from an admissions perspective. And my assumption is that mission-driven policies writ large across education will most likely be reasonably acceptable in a legal framework, because again, the basic mission of medical education is workforce development to move us toward health equity. And if we are doing something else, then we are not meeting our mission. It's difficult to see the law stating that we should do something other than meet our institutional and professional obligations.
And let me further that one and say that when you ground your admissions practices, when you ground the curriculum in your mission, then what you're doing is saying that what we try to accomplish as a medical school is what's really important. And if your students are consistent with allowing you to accomplish that mission, then that's who you need to bring into your medical school. And I think that's why the historically Black colleges have had a disproportionate share of minoritized individuals trained there, because they're all interested in the elimination of health disparities. They were founded to eliminate the health disparities that were not being cared for by the majority physicians in our country. And so that's why I think the historically Black colleges are essential, medical schools associated with those. And that's why watching what's happening down at Xavier with the Ochsner system, watching what's happening at Morgan now with the development of a new historically Black college, I think is essential. We have to increase the number of African-American physicians in this country to meet the demand of the people who are still subjected to this arcane notion that concordant care is what should be delivered. I mean, it's not what has to be delivered. I would hate to go into a world where the only physicians that a Black patient could see were Black physicians, but that's who cares for people. And where does this come from? This race-conscious professionalism. It starts when people choose to go to medical school. If you ask a first-year medical student who they're going to care for when they finish their medical training, whether they're going to care for underserved people, minoritized people, 24% of white and Asian students say this. Yet around 64% of African Americans say this, around 60% of indigenous first-year students say this. Now that maintains throughout the 4 years of medical school. When you graduate, the AAMC, Association of American Medical Colleges, asks you again, and those numbers are still the same. We haven't figured out a way of telling white and Asian students that taking care of everybody is important in a way that they actually internalize that and act upon it when they're in practice. But Black and Indigenous and Latinx individuals who choose careers in medicine do so understanding they're going to take care of a minoritized population. And that's what's essential about maintaining the diversity that we have in medical schools.
Thank you for that, Dr. McDade. Thank all of our responders, because I'd like to just add something to what you said, Dr. McDade. You know, in a lot of our medical schools, the medical school where I teach at present, we had, you know, community engagement. And so what the community engagement, of course, does is to align the students with, you know, underrepresented populations, socioeconomically deprived populations. And so, you know, those here in San Antonio, of course, is primary Latinx communities, but the students who, you know, have an affiliation, affinity, I mean the affiliation, but an affinity for these groups, they're not hard pressed to do that. You know, we are wanting to engage, you know, majority students and help them get exposed to these populations, and not saying that they don't, you know, care about these populations, but we literally will have to put in place, you know, programs so they can address and get exposed to those. Whereas, you know, we come from these communities. We know what these communities, these are our relatives. We are familiar with what we see. So it's not as hard pressed. So that just speaks to what you're saying, Dr. McDade. It's already there. Next, I would like to,
Dr. Walker, I just want to piggyback. I was recently speaking at one of the universities, and a woman came up to me. I can't remember if she was Caucasian or Asian, but she says, after hearing you speak, I realized I've never had a Black physician educator, right? So she's, you know, she's out, but through college, through medical school, any of that. And so when you talk about the representation of the Black physician, right? it's just what you're saying also, but also just our presence in institutions and what that means to others. And there is you know, while we're talking about medical schools, let's not even get on Black and African American faculty at our medical schools.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Our next question, this is going to be kind of personal. What have the benefits of DEI frameworks in your personal medical school education? What has that been like in your personal medical education? Consider your medical school, your residency, and or your fellowship when you answer this question. Dr. Henderson?
Thank you, Dr. Walker. I started medical school in 1978, and there wasn't much as far as DEI frameworks in existence in medical schools in 1978. And I can say for me personally that the time I spent in medical school was the least enjoyable part of my education. It was very trying. And I experienced imposter syndrome before that had a name. I experienced stereotype threat before that had a name. There were some supportive faculty, but there was no sort of system of support for those of us who were minoritized. It was, I think, sort of socially and culturally very challenging for me. And I think one of the things that I've tried to do in the 2 decades that I spent in medical education as a faculty member was to change that experience for students. Whether it was when I was student affairs dean or diversity dean or department chair, I mean, a big part of my goal was to make sure that the environment was more conducive to everybody's success than just the success of those in the majority. And the analogy that I always make is like, it's very rewarding or at least refreshing when you bump into yourself coming around a corner, at least every once in a while. And when that doesn't happen or hardly ever happens, that can be a really isolating experience. And that overall experience is not conducive to academic success. We know that social engagement is a prerequisite for academic engagement, which is a prerequisite for academic success. And so the learning environment, the climate needs to be suitable for students to reach some reasonable level of engagement in order to achieve success and generally not struggle mightily in the process.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson. Dr. McDade, would you
Well,
like
thank
to?
you very much, Dr. Walker. I think my experience personally was that I was the only African-American student in my medical school class. And you figure out of 104 students, having one African-American student is a bit of an aberration. But then you consider that that medical school was on the south side of Chicago. And when you think about the population of the south side of Chicago and recognize that the medical school that's situated there has only one African-American medical student in its first year class, you have to scratch your head and ask yourself, how could this be? What are we trying to do in society if we're not educating more physicians who look like the people who are being served by that institution? Now, I will tell you, it's a world-class institution. I got a wonderful education there. I was part of the MD PhD program, and I was the first one who was part of that program on the training grant from the National Institutes of Health, who's African American. But the point in this one is that when you look at what the odds are of you becoming a physician if you're African American, they're so slim. And then when you look at when that person gets into that environment, how unwelcome they are in that environment, it really puts that person in danger. It really speaks to the idea that it's not just diversity that you need. You need to have a sense of belongingness and inclusion in that environment so you can thrive and succeed as an educating participant. And so what we find is that when people aren't welcomed, aren't brought in those environments, and they're not treated equitably, they don't survive to the same extent that they would if they had been otherwise welcomed. I can say my experience in medical school was actually a pretty favorable one. Even though I was the only African American student in my class, I found a number of mentors, people who were part of the faculty who were African American, people who were part of the faculty who weren't, who really wanted to see me advance in my career, and that's wonderful. But not every minoritized student gets that. And we have to make sure that our medical schools are environments where you can actually see that happen. And what disturbs me about this woke medicine or do no harm group is the proponents are physicians. They're people in our own profession. Just a week ago, the American Academy of Dermatology had a resolution that said that dermatologists should disband their DEI programs. Well, how insane is that? I mean, African Americans represent about 2 or 3% of dermatologists, and yet they feel that they need to get rid of their DEI programs. And I will say, to the Academy's credit, they had a very robust schedule of things that they wanted to do to try to increase the diversity within dermatology. Yet you had elements in medicine within that profession that wanted to end those programs. And to me, that says that we're very conflicted in medicine, that we say that we want to care for patients, but I guess we don't want to care for all patients. We want to provide opportunities for everyone. This is what the legislation says, that discrimination is a bad thing. But yet we've been discriminating against people for generations, and we don't think that that's important to try to address.
Indeed.
So, Dr. Walker, I think back, Dr. Edith Thurby Jones. I went to the University of Arkansas. She was the first African American to enroll in an all-white medical school in the South. And Dr. Edith Thurby Jones shared with me that when she was in that medical school class, they put her in a box. She had to take classes from this box because they didn't even want her to breathe the air the white students breathe. And I remember Dr. Edith Thurby Jones telling me that. And after she told me that, though, I felt like I could do anything. But what Dr. McDade just talked about, that belonging and that inclusiveness. So we did have a diversity office, Mr. Bill Bachnight, bless his heart. I wanted to quit medical school. I wanted to go be a dancer. They sat me down and they talked to me about what it meant to stay, following through, because I'm like Dr. Henderson mentioned, the imposter syndrome, just in the isolation at times. And so when you think about, these DEI officers and these offices and what they mean to students who may have had my same experience, right? It's invaluable. And so I do know that I benefited from the emotional support, the mentorship, and the guidance.
Indeed. Thank you, Dr. Lawson. I think we're going to move to our questions from the audience. I'd like to begin with this first question. And for the sake of time, we have such richness and medical knowledge and experience here, but if we could give just probably one answer per question that we get so we can make sure people's questions are getting answered. So we have a question, this first question from the audience. It says, as a student applying for anesthesiology this fall, how much should I take in account the political climate of the places that I want to apply to for residency? Go for it.
Well, I'll jump in. I'm an anesthesiologist.
Yeah.
And so, I would say you should go to a program that, one, it suits your educational needs. If you want to be a person who serves the community, go to a place that looks like the place that you want to work eventually. I would say if you want to be an anesthesiologist and you're interested in research, don't let the fact that you're not going to be accepted in research fields deter you from doing that, because you might study a problem that's important to the African American population as an anesthesiologist. As an anesthesiologist, I studied sickle cell disease and the way in which sickle cell might be cared for by anesthesiologists and what new molecules we used at that no one else would have thought of if you hadn't been an anesthesiologist to think about how you might care for people. So I would say, don't let this climate of anti-affirmative action of racism, a resurgence of racism, deter you from going to the place that you think will give you the best possible education. With that said, look for places where there are mentors, people who can advance your career, where you aren't going to be alone necessarily if something were to happen, and challenge you in that way. It's always better to have allies. It's always better to have mentors than not be in a place where that can occur.
Indeed, I so agree with that, Dr. McDade. Thank you for that answer. I don't know if I'm so, these next two questions are similar. Okay, if this proposal gets passed, what does that mean for minority-led groups like SNMA and LMSA? Will this cause institutions to ban these groups in fear of losing funding? And then I'm just going to go on with the next one because they're very saying, I'm concerned that the next attack will be on the federally supported pathway programs such as HCOP. What will the next step from the medical world be to protect these programs? So these questions combined, in essence, are talking about the effect that it would have on like the Student National Medical Association or programs like HCOP, which I benefited from as well. So I'm going to ask Dr. Henderson to address this, if you would.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. With regard to the question about student organizations, I mean, if I understand the bill correctly, it speaks to structures that the medical school creates. And those student organizations, the medical school doesn't necessarily create. So I think students can gather and associate as they choose. What may be different is the institution's capacity to provide support for them, particularly financial support. But I think those organizations can continue to function, although again, they would be challenged if they couldn't receive financial support from the school. Although in some schools, financial support comes from students' fees, and if students pay those, then they may be able to designate how they use them. The other piece, I think, is a bit more challenging because many medical schools sponsor pathways programs, and those programs have specific target populations that generally reflect the community that the school is in. It should be possible to make sort of mission-driven arguments to continue those programs, and in particular, a recent case that the Supreme Court rejected was a challenge to Thomas Jefferson High School's admissions program, because they went from recruiting from 8 highly selective schools to recruiting more broadly from all the schools in the area and accepting students from all those schools. And that transformed their student population. And again, that was a mission-driven change that school made in its admissions policies that resulted in increased diversity. And so given the fact that the Supreme Court chose not to hear that, presumably that's an approach that they're okay with, and that may provide some protection to schools.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, our next question says, if a trainee experiences discrimination that impacts their education and training, what is your advice for them to address it if they are in an institution where retaliation is perceived to be likely? my dear Dr. Lawson?
That's a Dr. McDade question.
Is it a Dr. McDade
That's
question?
his specialty.
Well, Dr. Lawson, you've taken on this as like the challenge for the National Medical Association. And over the last couple of years, the National Medical Association has done extraordinary work in highlighting how people are being discriminated against and the sorts of things they can do. The answer is there's not a lot that you can do. My thinking is that what we need to be able to do is to figure out how to make our environments more inclusive. And that's one of the requirements that the ACGME has for its graduate medical education programs across the country. It accredits. Now, if you look at the legislation, the bill that we're talking about, there's actually a section that deals with the accreditation process of graduate medical education and specifically calls out the fact that we can't have requirements that ask people or ask the programs to have these sorts of protections. Now, to me, I think it's absurd that if people are discriminated against, that you don't try to stop it. There's a paper that we just actually published, our colleagues down in Boatwright and Dr. Nguyen, really looking at what happens to medical students who are the victims of discrimination. And there is greater attrition of those medical students who are in fact subjected to discrimination during the course of their training. So we don't want to lose anybody from medical school, let alone the few minoritized people that there are. And so the way that you do this is you make your environments more belonging. You increase the belongingness in your environments, make them more welcoming and supportive of those very same students who you're trying to keep out through these other sorts of measures.
Thank you. Indeed. Okay. This may be our last question for the audience before we go into talking to our panelists individually. The attacks on DEI seem rather well orchestrated. How do we fight back strategically, and how do we hold our professional organizations accountable? Madam President.
Certainly. So how do we fight back? I agree, whoever wrote that question, it is quite well orchestrated. And I'll admit it was orchestrated before even I realized, as I stated, over the past couple years, things began to come up to the surface. That's when I realized how well orchestrated it is and how blinding, I'll call it. When you have signs up, I was at a meeting and one of these organizations had a sign up around fighting discrimination. Something like that drew a lot of physicians, right, to their table and booth. But however, it is one of these entities and organizations, right, behind some of these lawsuits and behind some of these theories. And so I believe that we will all have to collectively, organizations with mutual alignment, all of us will have to collectively organize, communicate, and advocate. As you all, I'll share here, the NMA will be holding a press conference around this topic on April 11th in Washington, D.C. I am working with many other organizations, even interprofessional organizations. What we have seen is everyone is concerned. National Bar Association, the National Pharmaceutical Association, the National Dental Association. We're all, no matter the specialty, no matter the profession, we're all concerned about what these tactics will do on a diverse workforce for all of even the multidisciplinary specialties. So I welcome anyone to join us in our advocacy efforts.
Indeed, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lawson. And you just said that I was given a reminder about colloquium in April, but you just brought that up on April the 11th through the 14th in DC. Okay. And there it is on the screen, I guess, for everyone to see. All right, thank you. Well, as we move toward the end of our discussion, I would like to give each of our panelists just a minute to kind of give some closing remarks or call to action, whatever you see that that's fit for you to do in this 1 minute of time. And we will start just like we started before. Again, Madam President, giving you.
Absolutely. So African Americans are disproportionately impacted by almost every disease state, almost every chronic disease state you can think of, other than those that have a genetic predisposition. Black physicians, we have been integral in addressing these disparities. And so what I say is, we need more Black students in medical school. We need more providers and physicians of color, not less. And so again, this is a time like no other. I believe we are in the fight of our lives. I really do believe that. In this generation, in this time, I believe we really are there. And so again, if nothing else, this is most important that we promote voting, right? And we ensure that we're trying to have people in office who will, like I said, just do the right thing.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Lawson. Dr. McDade?
Well, this legislation is one of a number of pieces of legislation around the country. The Chronicle of Higher Education actually has been tracking this for the last couple of years. And if you look at the progress that people have been making in ending diversity statements, limiting access to offices for diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's rabid across the country now. Last year, there were about maybe 6 states that enacted this. Now there are like 15 or 16 states that have done this. And there are many more pieces of legislation. There are about 80 pieces of legislation across the country. So this one piece is not part of it. In part, it's these same conservative right-wing think tanks that are driving this legislation around the country. And it's all poorly written and poorly thought out. If you think about what they're trying to do, they're trying to take the language of diversity, equity, and inclusion and turn it around, akin to the Southern strategy back in the 70s. I mean, the whole idea that you can actually say we should get rid of diversity, equity, and inclusion, why would you ever want to get rid of equity in the environment that you're in? Last thing I'm going to say is that when you think about the impact that this legislation will have, it'll be none. Because it won't pass the House, probably. It certainly won't pass the Senate in the current Senate that we have. And the Democratic president won't sign this into law. So I'm not afraid of this particular piece of legislation, but it is the sentiment that drives this legislation that seems to be unstoppable, that there are people who have it in their mind that you have to drive out whatever success African Americans have been able to achieve. And it's almost a sickness. When you think about what the victory was for the Students for Fair Admission who sued Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, you had Asian students posturing. Asian students represent about 22% of medical students, but only 5% of the population, 6% of the population. African Americans represent 5% of medical students, but about 13% of the population. There's a small wedge of opportunity that exists. Why are you going after that 5% when you could go after the 70% that's out there that doesn't contain those minoritized people who are really depending, whose communities depend upon them? So I think it's terrible that this is what we have to do. But as Dr. Lawson said, this is a fight for the lives of our community, the lives of ourselves in the circumstances that we are today.
Indeed. Thank you, Dr. McDade. And bringing up the rear, Dr. Henderson.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. I don't think it was an accident that the affirmative action decision by the Supreme Court occurred about a year after the Dobbs decision. And those were, I mean, 2 longstanding precedents that were struck down within a year of each other. I mean, so there is a well-coordinated plan to roll the clock back. I mean, Reconstruction was followed by Jim Crow, and what we are experiencing now, I think, is essentially a similar effort and I think one of the most important things we need to do is for different communities to appreciate what they have in common with each other. Dr. King said that we are all bound in a common cloak of humanity. When I think I was a senior in high school, it occurred to me, and I can't remember exactly sort of where this little epiphany came from, but what's good for everybody is also good for me. And if we pursue common goods that benefit everyone, everybody benefits. The strategy that we're fighting against is one that wants to sequester power and exercise power. And that group is a relatively small group. And I think they only win if they're allowed to be victorious. And I will echo what Dr. Lawson said. We all need to vote. I'm not here to tell you how to vote, but we all need to vote because the people in public office who are able to write laws will write the laws that their constituents, that they think their constituents want them to write. And we need to make sure that that we show up at the ballot box, because that's where our power is.
It is indeed. And thank you all. I'll take this opportunity to give just a closing remark myself. And I've been thinking about exactly what I would say. So voting is important, but what is also important is just what we're seeing this evening. We're seeing Dr. Henderson, Dr. McDade, an NMA president, Dr. Lawson, and then Dr. Walker and myself here on this meeting. And why are we on this meeting? We're on this meeting because we care about the next generation of doctor, the next generation of minoritized doctor. And I'm going to just leave with you something that the late Reggie Jones of Chicago. Dr. Jones spent 40 years helping Black students get into medical school. I was in Texas and I heard of this man. And one of the things he said to me, he made a promise to me. He said, I will see you in medical school and I will see you graduate. And he did. And when I graduated, I was so excited. I said, Dr. Jones, what can I do? I said, when I get some money, can I send a gift back to the CHAMPS program? Can I do something? And he says, young lady, you do what I did for you. You help the next group of students get into medical school. That's all I'm asking for you. I'm not asking for your money. I want you to do for someone else what I did for you. And that's what I will leave this meeting saying, is that it's incumbent upon all of us to do our part. We can go to the polls and we can vote, but we can also help in these pathway programs. We can be involved with the NMA and other organizations of influence, and we can do for others what someone did for us. And don't act like they didn't do it for us, because they did do it for us. That's all I have to say. Thank you guys so very, very much. Thank you for the anyone who attended tonight's session. Again, stay in tune. The National Medical Association is continuing this effort, and if you can contribute to that effort, please do so. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
good evening. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all.